just shoot. I'll just say, before you do, I'll just say this is Reading Plato, Spring 2020, Wednesdays, Session 3, Body and Soul. And welcome everyone. So did anyone have any questions about that? What's other activities?
What do you mean other activities?
Oh, just the other courses that we are planning on running, that's all.
Oh, I think I'd like to, I'm sorry I'm late, I apologise.
Oh,
will you
that's
send
okay.
us an email with everything listed?
I can send you an email. Yes, I could send you an email. I'll probably send you an email in the last, for the last session. But you can certainly look at their website. So if you just Google Plato,
they are on the website.
And go straight to courses, and it'll list all the courses and the ones that we've got scheduled. It'll tell you there. But we haven't finalised February next year, but we've finalised the ones that start just after Cup Week. So we were going to start Cup Week, but it's pushing quite close to Christmas. I think we're going to the middle of December, but we kind of had to avoid Cup Week because we kind of thought that maybe Cup Week's going to be this crazy time when everyone leaves town. Because it might be the first time you're allowed to leave town, and Melbourne will just be deserted.
Maybe we can go to the town or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't think by mid-December we're going to be allowed to be going out to too many parties anyway.
No. So yeah, so best to stay in and do Platonic Academy courses, I'd say.
Exactly.
Okay. So tonight we're going to just do a little bit of revision. You know, how far have we actually come? Maybe not very far, but maybe a long way also conceptually. We'll go over the key points of skepticism, wisdom, the forms, and then we'll get on to today's reading. So, but we will start for the final time, just with the reflection again on my cup. So this is the final time we'll talk about this, but this is related to the skepticism topic, you know. So once again, everything I know about the cup is in my senses. It's in my sight, it's in my touch, it's in my hearing. Nothing I know about the cup is beyond my senses. Every time I kind of think that there's something beyond my senses, I actually realize that it's in one of my senses. So there's nothing beyond my senses. Nothing I know of the cup is beyond my senses. The cup is a construction from my senses in my mind, in me. All my experience, my entire sensual world is in me. Now, most philosophies come to this point, which is sometimes called the mind-body problem. Where you go from here is what matters. It's good to get a clear picture of the problem before jumping to the solution. What happens is this: I start with this naive view that the sensible object, the cup, is immediately known, but independent from me. Then on reflection, like what we did just then, I find that my knowledge of it and its being is entirely within me. It seems to be independent from me. It seems to be the same cup that you see, but yet it's in me. It doesn't make sense. So in coming to Plato, it helps to be skeptical of our cultural accepted ways of seeing things, to question them and introduce doubt. Platonic philosophy starts with skepticism, and what we call so-called Socratic skepticism, referred to in the Apology and exemplified last week in Euthyphro. Socrates' question and answers, the inquiry through question and answers, is used to find contradictions and circular arguments in apparently reasonable and well-founded views. Skepticism clears away the illusions of foundations in habitual thinking. Now, from this skepticism, we're starting to build Plato's alternative way of seeing. We will be starting to turn around, as he says, to look up rather than looking down. But it does take some time to see what Plato is saying. So don't panic. Now, so that's the skepticism, and now the wisdom. So Plato teaches what he calls philosophy, philosophia, philo, love, sophia of wisdom. But what is wisdom? Plato's view is that true wisdom is divine. Remember we got that in the Apology? What do we take this divine to mean? Well, we can take it to mean a lot of things, but I encourage you to think about it that in the way that Plato is trying to push away from popular stories of the traditional gods that were around at his time for a more pure, if you like, high church notion of divinity. Wisdom and its objects, the ideal forms, have the higher characteristics of divinity. These objects of wisdom are insensible, they're invisible, insensible, you can't see or feel them. They're outside time, they're timeless, they're unchanging, and yet somehow they're actively present in the world. That's how I suggest you take Plato's divinity without taking along a whole lot of other baggage as well. I think that's a helpful interpretation. So how do we mere humans get to this divine wisdom? Well, Plato says it's by inspiration or enthusiasm, which literally means being filled with God or God within. This is how wisdom is received. And we can think of it, if you like, in Christianity, a similar word was used called revelation. So wisdom is not something that you work out by reasoning, although reasoning can help you get there. And once you know it, you can give an account of it and persuade others of it through reason. The mystery cults prior to and during Plato's time had their method of enlightenment through a progression of rites and practices. Plato's way of enlightenment was different. It was to use discussion, what he called dialectic, reason, logos, as well as old-fashioned mythos. Wisdom is an envisaging or an insight. Wisdom can be difficult to distinguish from madness, just as it's difficult to distinguish from divine madness of the oracles or prophets from ordinary delusional madness. It's hard to tell which is which. But there's no solution, there's no way of settling with proof or finding a falsehood through contradiction. It's a hazardous method. So how do we start to look towards these Platonic forms, to turn around and look towards the forms? Now, one way we started was to think about the idea of piety and then the ideal of justice. Justice we found hard to define, yet we all seem to have a sense of what it is. We have a kind of an immediate sense of what it is, which we reflect on when we try to define justice or understand what is just in a particular situation. Where does this idea of justice come from? Now, I mentioned the Platonic doctrine that the essence of things is like the essence of number. what is the essence of two? We have lots of examples of two cups, two pens, two anything you like. But what is two, actual two in itself? That's another way of thinking the nature of the forms in our everyday experience, our everyday life. So perhaps we don't reflect on justice, what justice is in itself and where it comes from, and what two is in itself and where it comes from. But this is a sort of reflection that Plato's encouraging you to have so that you can see things the way he sees them. So that's as far as we got with Platonic formalism. There's more to come today, and there's more to come in the next few weeks. But for now, I'm really interested to hear if you've got any questions about the skepticism, about wisdom, about the forms, anything at all.
Are you suggesting that Donald Trump is wise and not mad?
Trump always comes in, doesn't he? Yeah. Do you want to just expand on that? In what sense?
Oh, I don't know. You just said that wisdom isn't something that includes reasoning, and it's a form of madness.
Oh, well, it's
Fine.
hard to distinguish from madness. That's the point. It's hard to distinguish because you see the other methods, the other modern methods. There's this kind of belief that you can prove true and false through saying things and working things out explicitly in language and, if you like, in the world. But you can't really do that with this, and that's a problem. It's a problem with the field, that it's hard. And there's dialogues where Plato discusses this. It's very hard to distinguish wise thinking in this area from mad thinking. So he talks of divine madness is the true way of thinking, but it's very hard to distinguish from someone who's completely delusional if you're not in tune with what's being talked about. So it doesn't mean Donald Trump's, it doesn't mean Donald Trump is wise.
No.
He might be though, he might be.
So is it different, is wisdom different to what in our society when we say that, you know, someone that perhaps has lived to 100, you know, they've got wisdom and they're wise because they've experienced a lot of the world, they've just what comes with age and life and people.
Yeah. No. Well. Yes. He's not saying that. He's saying that actually to become wise, you need to actually become enlightened. You need to follow a process, and this process is to turn the mind's eye around and to look at the actual essence of things, which is not kind of there in every particular material body, which is kind of what you initially perhaps think. You turn the mind around and you look at the generalities and the forms of things, the generalities of things. And so generalities like justice, we mentioned equality, and I mentioned the number two. Now, these are things that are all kind of, well, some of these things like the number two or the number one, you know, it's kind of there, it's always there, but we don't focus on it and we don't focus on what its nature is. So wisdom is about going on a journey, focusing on the forms and then paying attention to them and then following a step procedure towards a greater awareness of the true nature of things.
The forms aren't necessarily something that we... So when we're talking about wisdom, we're talking more about enlightenment, or we should think of it more as enlightenment. So, you know, like trying to achieve nirvana in, you know, to sort of choose a particular pinnacle of, you know, ascendant wisdom. So when Plato and Socrates use the word wisdom, they're not using it in that sort of mundane, not mundane, but in the practical sense. You know, I'll be able to make wiser decisions. I'll be able to. They're using it more as the unveiling of the ultimate truths that sit behind our existence.
That's right. It's got this narrow, specific meaning, and of course, in our language, it's come to mean other things, and we're using a different word after all. We're not using the Greek word Sophia, but it was the Pythagoreans and Plato who chose this word Sophia to define what they're talking about. So the practice of love of Sophia is this practice of turning around and paying attention to the objects of Sophia, the objects of wisdom, which are the forms. And yeah, that's right. So it's, yeah, any common definition, I suppose, is something different, because we're teaching Plato's view here. We're using these terms trying to use these terms in his way.
And is there a difference between, when it comes to the forms, there are these, you give examples of, a concrete, structures, cup, building, etc. But then we also talk about sort of more esoteric ideas such as justice, number two. Do you know what I mean? There's this kind of, perhaps I'm sort of starting to get a better idea when it comes to these sort of concrete ideas of the form, but then there's these sort of more esoteric.
Okay, Nick. I'll have a go at that. If you go to university and you learn about what's Plato's theories of forms, you will be told the way Aristotle understood them. You go and read Aristotle criticizing the theory of forms, that's what you'll get at university. And very much people get this notion that up in heaven somewhere, in this other ideal world, there are these little ideal cups.
Yes.
That are expressed in all the cups. And there's the ideal horse and table and chair. And maybe also the ideal computer is there, sitting, waiting to be invented or something. And that's really as far as they get. And I want you just to throw that away. You can't really replace it with anything else, but just think, when you're walking around, think about justice or equality or two. What is its nature? And then perhaps another way, if you do want to leap forward, because Nick, you are very keen to leap forward, I suggest patience, but another way to think about it is think of modern physics, right? And how modern physics has to conform with mathematics. If you can't express it, if you can't give it a mathematical logos, a mathematical account, then that's a problem. So the problems in quantum physics are problems because you can't give a consistent mathematical account. You can't express it in mathematics. Well, I'll say to you, Nick, think of the forms as mathematics. It's not like they're individual things all sitting there like horses and tables and chairs. It's a complexity of things. And it always was in Plato. And just these people get this really weird idea that it's just like these little, archetypes, like molds.
Yes.
That print out
Absolutely.
people or print out the horses or whatever. Think of it as the mathematics. All physics has to be expressed mathematically in modern physics. Otherwise, it's thrown out, or physics comes into a crisis, as it does with quantum physics. Just call that the forms. Sit there with that, and you'll get kind of you'll get a bit more of an idea.
Okay.
And is this the argument that Socrates puts forward for the difference between that which is mathematical of the earth and as opposed to the properties of the soul, where he was going, he was describing his death and why he thought philosophers should be proud to die, because you know, they were going to move on to a platform, if you like, let's think of it as a platform, whereby they would be in a perfect world, you know, separated from their body, separated from pain and all those other things that are earthly, and living within the utopia, if you like, of the soul. I don't know, am I making any sense?
Yes, you are, and I think you're giving us a good segue into starting to talk about our reading. And why don't we do that and come back to maybe bring your question back again, maybe in a different form, and when we get to the end, that'd be great. So why don't I launch in now? So if you've got any further questions, you know, write them down or something, and we'll certainly get to them, or you can put them in the chat, and Maria might be able to have a look, because I don't tend to look, and she can let me know if I miss anything. Thanks, Maria. All right, so let's get to the dialogue now. Okay, so the Phaedo. So far we've been mostly been reading Platonic skepticism, but we're now moving to a more affirmative philosophy. From this week, we'll be reading the Phaedo right through to the end of the course now, which is one of Plato's most most important works and most influential dialogues. These days, it's more influential than famous, because actually not many people know about it. They know about the Republic, but you don't often hear about the Phaedo. While our discussion going through this will focus on the readings, I'll take you through the entire text. So I'll fill in the gaps for you, so you get a sense of the entire dialogue as we go along. So let's begin. We actually skip the framing narrative, what's called the framing narrative. Now, Plato's dialogues often have this framing narrative where someone is recounting the conversation that happened at an earlier time, sometimes actually almost an absurdly long time ago. Sometimes there is a narrative within a narrative, and a narrative within a narrative within a narrative. In this case, an acolyte of Socrates, Phaedo, is asked to recount the discussion between Socrates and his gathered friends in the prison on his last day. So, it's dawn in the prison on the last day, the last possible discussion with Socrates ever. Now, Socrates could have escaped, and we know this from the previous dialogue, Crito. The guards had been bribed, the boat was ready, but Socrates chose not to go. In the audience, in the prison, there's, oh, excuse me, could people just turn their mics off? I think there's just a bit of problem with the noise. I also have a problem with the internet, so I hope you don't lose me all of a sudden. I will try to hotspot on my phone if that happens. Anyway, so we're in the prison. In the audience, there's lots of interesting people, and it's worth considering these. So firstly, there's Pythagoreans. I've mentioned them. They got into this mathematical philosophy, which Plato then pursued and practiced and researched in the academy. So in the framing narrative, there's actually a Pythagorean, Echecrates. So he's Pythagorean. And then in the prison scene itself, Socrates is mostly addressing questions to Cebius and Simmias, students of Philolaus. And Philolaus was perhaps the founder of the mathematical approach to philosophy taken up by the academy. So also in the prison is Aristophanes, who's the founder of the Cynics. Now, we don't know much about these pre-Socratic philosophers, I think I've said before, because we only have fragments of their work mentioned by people sometimes much later. What we think that Aristophanes taught was virtue, living according to nature, and in poverty. Later on, Cynics, you might know, became famous for living in utter destitution. We also have in the prison Euclides of Megara. Now, the Megarians, a town fairly close to Athens, were skeptics who followed Parmenides and Zeno. Now, Zeno, you might know of Zeno's paradoxes. You might have heard of that before. He set up paradoxes to bring down any pretensions to knowledge. They were utter skeptics, and the Megarians were followers of Parmenides and Zeno, and they are become prominent, Megarians, in the later dialogues of Plato, the Sophist and the Parmenides, where they feature instead of Socrates. And then there's a mention, I think this is not in the reading, but then there's a mention, like, who was there? And saying, but Plato was sick. So Plato's this invisible figure always in the background, the narrator, the inventor of this story. So if we look around here in the framing narrative, but in the prison, we can see that Socrates has around him key representatives of the main schools of philosophy that Plato respected. So this is kind of like his hero's Last Supper. Okay, so our reading today starts with Socrates removing the manacles, and then he feels this rush of pleasure. Pleasure follows pain. One follows the other. They are somehow united, but they never come at the same time. And it goes the other way. Pain follows pleasure. If you pursue pleasure, pain will surely come. It's not endless pleasure. This introduces the theme of opposites, which will be a theme that continues throughout this dialogue, and in fact, throughout Plato's entire work. So then after this, a question is passed from the poet Evenus. He's not there, but he passes on a question. Why has Socrates recently taken up writing poetry? So I think someone asked last week about dreams in this group. Socrates has had a recurring dream instructing him to practice and cultivate the arts. Now, actually, the Greek word for arts here, I'm not sure what it's saying in your translation, is from where we get our word for music from, musiki. It has a narrower meaning of music, and in that narrow meaning, poetry was considered music. And so that's the narrower meaning, but the word actually comes from musika, of the muses. So its broader meaning is the arts in general. According to the broader meaning, the dream is encouraging Socrates to just keep doing what he's doing. Philosophy, after all, is the highest art, the highest form of music. But just in case he misinterpreted the dream, and it's getting pretty close to the end of times, Socrates decides to practice some of this music qua poetry. So in explaining this, we get a segue to one of the main themes of the dialogue, which is Socrates closing his reply to Evenus with a farewell, encouraging him to follow as quickly as he can. To follow as quickly as he can? What do you mean by that, Socrates? So at first glance, it looks like some kind of suicide cult, that Socrates is suggesting that after he dies, Evenus should top himself. Socrates asks, is not even as a philosopher? He suggests that he's only reiterating the Pythagorean teaching. Now remember, Cebes and Simmias were students of Philolaus, the famous Pythagorean. Anyway, there follows a reference also to secret doctrines of the mysteries, perhaps, where he says that this teaching is our current life is a prison. Now, we should also note here that the Pythagoreans and the mystery cult of Orpheus have very strong associations. But anyway, Plato says, suicide is wrong because it's disrespectful to the gods who are our guardians and keepers. You need to wait for a benefactor, like the state of Athens in the case of Socrates. Lucky Socrates. Athens is doing a good thing for him by killing him. So philosophers should not commit suicide, yet be ready and willing to die. And here Simmias puts in a plea, oh, don't leave us, Socrates. This sets up an argument for the afterlife of the soul. I'm going to gods who are good masters. Socrates will be with gods and better people. There is even a suggestion of reward and punishment in the afterlife, as Achilles was mentioning earlier. So what does it mean that to study philosophy is to study nothing about dying and being dead? All agree that death is a release of the soul from the body. It's kind of like presumed here, although it comes into contention later, the whole issue of the body and the afterlife. And the life after death is the life of the soul. Pursuit of philosophy is to renounce bodily pleasure. Indeed, philosophers despise the body. One who cares nothing for the body is as good as dead. Philosophers are half dead already. Philosophy is a preparation for dying and death. Death is a release from the pursuit of bodily pleasures, bodily adornments. The philosopher's soul is disdainful of the body. She wishes to be free from its chains, free from slavery to the body. This is why the true philosopher makes dying his profession. Now, I don't know about you, but this is undeniably morbid. There should be one of those health warnings on this to say, like they have on TV, saying, you know, there's help if this depresses you. What's really weird about it all, and weird to his audience, is that Socrates is playful and cheery all along. Now here there's, I just jump forward a bit because there's this passage around page 68a, an interesting discussion of lover and beloved that's worth dwelling on briefly. The analogy of lover and beloved that will become an important theme through Platonism. In fact, another group that met last night that Maria's in, we were getting right into this in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium. And it goes right through Plato and Platonism into Islamic philosophy and into Sufism and even into medieval Platonism, especially in Spain. Okay, so what he's saying here is when a beloved wife or child dies, the loving husband or father wants to die too, has this kind of desire to die too, to be with them in the other world. Likewise, the lover of wisdom, the philosophia, wants to die to be with his beloved Sophie, Sophia, wisdom. The philosopher aims to purify himself from the body until the divine himself gives deliverance. In his aim of acquiring wisdom, The physical body is a distraction. Moreover, we all agree that hearing and seeing are not accurate. And this is a segue to the discussion of the forms, to the looking the other way. Okay, so the philosopher is reaching up towards this reality of the forms, like the form of absolute justice, as we discussed last week, also absolute beauty and goodness. We never see the absolute with our eyes. It's unseen, altogether insensible. And there follows a declaration here that philosophy is to pursue the essence and underlying quality of everything. The philosopher looks towards the real nature of any given thing, like my cup, what it actually is, its essence or underlying quality. So we looked at justice and beauty and so forth, but now forms are not just about some high ideal like justice or beauty, but every darn thing. To get there, one needs to meditate on reality alone without the senses, like a retreat through meditation away from the body and the sensible world. To understand the essential being of all sensible things, we must go away from the realm of the sensible things and into this formal realm. He says, we must be free from the body and must behold the actual realities with the eye of the soul alone. Page 66D. Arising to truth is a purification of the soul. The practice of philosophy is the soul fully detaching itself from the physical body so that it's ready for an easy transition to the pure life of the soul after death. Towards the end of today's reading, there's a distinction drawn with ordinary self-restraint and virtue. Ordinary virtue is based in fear, like a fear of missing out of some other pleasure, or fear of a loss or a punishment. This is not true virtue, which comes through attention to these higher truths. So, what's he saying? The philosopher's soul prepares for death by detaching itself from the bodily concerns and passions. Instead, she focuses on the insensible forms or the essence of all being. If the soul does this well, then she is well prepared for transition into the afterlife. So, that's the Phaedo so far. I'm really interested in what your initial impressions are. And so, yeah, any impressions, any comments, any questions? Go for it.
So Socrates is, he's claiming that the soul is immortal, and that death is separating the body from the soul. So it's like a mind from body experience. Is that right?
So yes, so there's this very strong distinction being pushed here between body and soul. It's quite remarkable and distinctive in Plato's teaching at this time, perhaps derived from the mystery cults and from and the Pythagoreans, but very distinctive. And this notion of the soul is very distinctively Platonic. So yeah, he makes this strong distinction, and the progress of philosophy is a progress of detachment, from attachment to the passions of the body, from attention towards sensible things and attachment to sensible things, moving away from that towards attention towards what is universal and divine, as we've previously defined it. That's right. And I might just say here, Achilles, that also he just kind of declares this here, right? It just sort of comes out and, you know, okay, so he can, and we can take it or leave it. But what it does set up is a discussion, well, how do you know this? And as we go through the dialogue, there's a lot of discussion around what has just been presented to us.
Well, yeah, his examples of, you know, what is tall can become shorter, or tallest is shortest, and all these sorts of things, which he describes. But in the end, he concludes that the soul is the soul, and it's unchangeable, and it's not. It is the most not wholly of ideals or ideas or concepts, but just one that is, again, unchangeable.
Yes, it is, yes. Yes, unchanging, yes, in some sense. And so we'll go into more about this whole idea of life after death of the soul, and also particularly life before birth as well. And
Yes.
around that. I mean, and this is where for me, this is where all the interesting topics come up.
Yeah,
And,
I particularly like this concept of you know, when the reincarnation. There was a passage in there. I don't remember where it was exactly, but that he believed that the soul is reincarnated, and that how he explained it was that well, you know, there are certain things that we just know as we come into existence as babies and young adults and so on. So,
can I just stop you there, Achilles, because
yes.
you really are jumping ahead. I think you
sorry.
whole dialogue have you? Yeah. So we'll take it all in stages, but that's a really important thing that we're going to get to, I think, next week. So
I see. Okay.
yeah, so that's his theory of recollection. You know,
Yes.
how you're born with this knowledge, but you forget it, and then through your sensible life you come to remember it. You remember the things, you're reminded of them. But
like I said, it was a great read. Very in depth.
But we'll take it a stage at a time, and we'll just focus on this reading today. So yeah, I'm wondering how anyone felt about this really strong distinction between mind and body, and this rejection of the body.
What if it seems to be that it was just accepted that Socrates said that there's a separation of the body and the soul. Was there any discussion that perhaps there was no soul? That once the body passes physically, the last breath, after that, that's it, that there's no soul?
Well, there were certainly people at the time, well, later we know, that seemed to believe that. There was atheism in a very strong way, especially following Plato and probably before him, and certainly rejection of this belief. But what's probably worth mentioning now is giving kind of a context to this declaration. So as I said, this declaration that's made here about the soul and the body is quite extraordinary and particular to Plato, perhaps to his tradition of the through the mystery cults. We don't know, because they were the mysteries cults had a very strong secret policy. But anyway, we do know what Plato was presenting. Now, the word for soul here is psyche, or I'm going to say psyche, because actually the English word psyche is fairly close to the meaning around the time. Now, prior to, so the word has these connotations, certainly of animal life. So like, and a suggestion of breath. So the breath in animal life. So not just humans, but other animals. And in fact, in the translation into Latin was anima. So animation. that sort of thing. So if you think of that, that's one thing. So it has this broad meaning, and with the reincarnation thing, that kind of helps too, because you can be reincarnated in animals. So that's the thing. But also what's interesting is if you go back and look at Homer and you go back and look at the earlier writings well before Plato, psyche is only really mentioned as like the spirit leaving the body and existing afterlife, maybe in the underworld, because it was an underworld then, Hades and all that stuff. But not that you had this psyche, this opposition between psyche and body in your current life, in your existence. So this is very distinctive of Plato. And he just declare that, and everyone nods their heads and everything. Not all of them necessarily agree, as we will see, with what he's saying. But yeah, it does sound like in what we've read that this is just all accepted by everyone. Not at all.
Also, the symbol for psyche was the butterfly. And it was believed that the butterfly was a sign from the afterworld and like communication between the gods and the mortals. And it was a big no-no to kill a butterfly. And I think that even in a lot of cultures, you're not to kill a butterfly because you could be killing one of your ancestors, the spirit of your ancestor.
Great.
Bernie, can you explain why it was frowned upon to suicide? Like let's say they wanted to go up there and be with the gods and the wiser philosophers up there, and that's what they've been doing. So they wanted to be up there to join them. Why couldn't they commit suicide to get up there?
Well, you could approach that in very different ways. I mean, you can approach it in a sociological or an anthropological way when you have these religious doctrines that teach how marvelous life can be in after death. And maybe someone's got a miserable life. Maybe they're a slave, or maybe they are, someone working down in a salt mine or something. Yeah, you sort of think, well, I've been pretty virtuous. If I kill myself now, it's better than working in this salt mine. So that's probably an anthropological question as a skeptic. And this is certainly features also in Christianity. I don't know whether you know, people forget the prohibition on suicide was very strong in Christianity. And in my tradition, if someone committed suicide, they were not allowed to have it. When I was young, they were not allowed to have a funeral.
Yeah.
So it was this very strong prohibition, and say, your body will just be thrown. You won't get the last rites. You won't get anything. Your body will just be thrown, in the pit. So Christianity has this as well, and you can see why it has it. So, it does make you wonder. Plato says, people came to him. Socrates said this, and then it's sort of like, yeah, well, why don't we all just kill ourselves then? If we're ready, maybe we do a bit of philosophy and then we're ready and then we kill ourselves. Well, yeah. He says, well, it's disrespectful for the gods because they're our guardians. What kind of answer is that?
Same with Greek Orthodox religion. Suicides are not accepted in the church.
Yeah, there's a very strong prohibition, isn't there? Right.
But in other religious traditions as well, it's just across the board. Suicide is a no-no. I mean, you're not supposed to do no harm, even to yourself. You do not do any harm. I mean, euthanasia in ancient Greek then had a different meaning to what it has now, like assistant death, assistance in death.
Yeah, well, there's another form of assistant. Let's not focus too much on this macabre thing, but it is interesting because there's another form of assisted death that became, to a certain extent, we don't want to graduate it, quite a cult in early Christianity, where you remember. So remember when Plato says you have. Sorry, didn't make this mistake. Socrates says that you have to wait for a benefactor to do the job for you. So he's getting, he didn't escape, he's getting the state to kill him. Well, there's other situations where you can do that. And there was, to a certain extent, a cult of martyrdom in early Christianity. And it did get quite, did get quite extreme. So, it is an interesting dynamic in a teaching where you have this teaching of an afterlife, of wonderful, of bliss, or of wonderful, when you're living quite a miserable life, perhaps. Okay.
And also generals, especially Roman generals would ask their either them if they could not top themselves off, you know, after they lost the battle or whatever, they would ask a friend or a slave to do it for them, and that was the honorable way out.
Right. All right.
We can recommend it to a few CEOs, probably.
On that note, let's.
Japanese have their own version.
I've got an interesting observation to make. Can I share it?
Absolutely.
Bernie?
Of course.
Yeah. Because I find this process fascinating. Even when we had the first session, you were talking about the cup and our senses and using our senses to connect with the cup and understand it, the sight, the touch, the smell, and that the cup, it's sensible, you know, it's, and that's how we know it, through our senses and all the physicality. And now that's come back regarding moving from the sensible to insensible and the divine, and making the transition from that and being liberated from the body to go to the psyche or the psyche, the soul. I find that interesting. And since we've been talking about suicide and it's connected to mental health, I suppose, I can't help saying, in a way, the progression of Plato is a little bit opposite from the progression or some of the processes in modern psychology. Because I'm aware in situations of trauma or where people it's called dissociation from the body, where people are in a traumatized state and they're not quite connected to their body. They're just out of body experiences. An interesting intervention that's used in psychological processes is to get a person to actually get in touch with their senses again, which is the opposite process in a way to what Plato's suggesting, we're getting in touch with the divine, because the divine almost seems to be a kind of out-of-body surreal experience of transcendence to the soul, whereas the actual modern process in psychology is to get people to come back into their body and to get in touch with their senses. It's actually used as a therapeutic process. It's got all sorts of names as well, and there's all sorts of interventions that are linked to it, and it's to actually bring someone back to their senses, experiencing their senses and being back in their body, because what's happened through trauma and the trauma impacting on the brain, there's a disconnection between the senses, the brain, and where a person's awareness is, sort of self-awareness.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense? Like,
it certainly makes sense.
Because I find it fascinating. Yeah.
So there's interesting stuff going on in there, and there's probably nuances to draw out, but there's certainly, you know, what is the difference? What is the sameness about what they're talking about? I mean, the first thing is, I suppose, that the process has stages, right? Mm-hmm. And also, especially in the early stages, and we will get to this with some of the stuff that Achilles mentioned earlier. At the early stages, that attention to your senses is very important. right? This isn't, this isn't,
Mm.
it is at the later stages and in your meditation or whatever, but when you're in the world, you know, attention to your senses is not rejected. What is rejected is saying that the essence of the beings of the things in your senses are beyond your senses in some material particularity. Okay, so the cup has this material being that that's the essence of its being. It's coming away from that, but that doesn't mean don't pay attention to your senses, your sensual experience. In fact, you know, think of a lot of meditation techniques that actually use attention to your senses to take you on a journey away from this of materialism, if you like. Now, another thing to mention, of course, is that moving away from your senses is not moving towards delusions. And there would be patients, I suppose, who have problems with a fantasy or distraction or something else that where they're trying to get, where they, you know, it's a reaction and they're trying to get away from, and so they go into some other imaginary world or delusional world or whatever. And so that's not it. But one interesting thing to reflect on is in techniques of psychology is things like improving self-esteem. Now, one interpretation of that would be exactly the opposite to what Plato is recommending here, which is kind of like interpretation that might be to build a strong ego self, right? In terms of yourself in the world, the self at work, you know, in your family, in your work, but, you know, your name, your profession, your ego self, your social self. Plato is saying to move away from that. So in some interpretations of self-esteem and improving self-esteem, it would be the opposite to what Plato is suggesting. Okay, any other questions? I'm interested how people find this notion of detachment and progressive detachment, and if they've got any reflections on that, and maybe if it relates to any other sort of practice that they've been doing.
I mean, we're usually introduced to detachment via, you know, Buddhist principles. So it is that that we, you know, as I'm reading through all of this, I keep on sort of seeing echoes, I guess, of other religions and other, you know, philosophies that have either been influenced by Plato and by Socratic thinking. And I guess I'm trying to sort of, there's this sort of tension that you have between our modern way of thinking about things. So this idea of not believing your senses is something that we've been introduced to in various sort of scientific studies that are sort of showing that, you know, they're starting to actually question our own, how each individual sort of sees reality in a slightly different way. And so there's all these sort of the sort of resonances that you find in something that was written 2,500 years ago that we're only really, it feels like we're rediscovering something that people had uncovered such a long time ago, and we're only just starting to, you know, to appreciate it again.
Well, thanks for that, Nick. I'll just, you know, make a few comments on that, and thanks. That's very helpful. Look, it comes up in every session. It comes up in this introduction, and it comes off so often when people first discover our own tradition. It's like Buddhism. It's like the Eastern stuff. It's like, oh, you know, where did it come from? Did it come from the East? It's quite amazing that we have lost our own tradition. And this came right through Christianity, right? This detachment teaching came right through the mysticism in our tradition, continuously right through the Middle Ages. I don't know whether anyone's heard of Meister Eckhart from the 14th century. His key teaching was detachment in this sense, and it is in the Platonic tradition. And the reincarnation stuff, that was taught in the early church. It was a doctrine of the early church fathers, the patriarchs, as they say, especially the ones in Alexandria, which we'll get to in that other course. So a lot of this stuff has always been there in our tradition, and you know, it's wonderful for me to see people, you know, through this course becoming aware that they don't have to turn to the East. They don't have to turn to the Sanskrit. They can come back and to their very own tradition and discover some real value. We'll take it or leave it. Some really real value for how to live a good life.
Wasn't it also in the ancient Egyptian tradition, the detachment of the soul and the journey of Ta and reincarnation, obviously with a little bit more materialistic, because you needed physical things for the afterlife, but even the judgment of the soul and also having coins to pay for, well, the ferryman, and to help people to or deities to help you through this journey. And some of those traditions were there long before Plato. And if we believe that the Pythagoreans did travel around and had visited Egypt, obviously there was an amalgamation of thinking that was brought back to Greece.
Thanks for that, Maria. And I'll just say another thing that's very important, because especially in the 19th century, there was a real cult of the Greeks and the Romans, especially in Germany and in Britain, basically saying that they invented everything that they taught. And if you actually go and read them, they're deferential all the time. It's very important to say that whoever their leader was, whether it was Pythagoras or Plato or Philolaus or whatever else, that he spent 20 years with the priests in Egypt, and then another 20 years with the Babylonians before he then came back and did his teachings. So they're very deferential to the prior traditions, and I hope I'm not I hope I'm not being too strong in saying that this is particular to the Greeks or to Plato. We don't really know. We do know that psyche, this interpretation of psyche and this use of psyche was particular and wasn't shared by other philosophical traditions and necessarily the general public at the time.
But I think so it's almost like so you're sort of basically saying there's this synthesis that has occurred. So there are traditions in the past, but at some point, not at some point, there's been a synthesis of various other sort of traditions that have kind of almost culminated in Plato and his teachings, and they seem to have come closest to giving us a glimpse of the truth, or of a
Well, if you're a Platonist, you would say that, I suppose, wouldn't you? I mean, I suppose an important thing to say here is that there was something very particular about Christianity in that it promoted this exclusivism, right? And this is kind of like, we kind of still live in this. But if you go through traditions, East and West, and go right back to the earliest civilizations in our tradition, to the Egyptians and Babylonians, right through that tradition, you generally don't get this exclusivism. It's sort of like, oh, you've got wise people in your tradition too. Let me talk to them. Let's swap notes. Let's all find the truth together. They might disagree, but it's not like, we've got the only truth, we've got the only God or the only revelation or whatever, and yours are all wrong. So that's probably the main message to put there. Like, you come to Plato, you have a look at what he's saying. Probably a lot of the ideas have come from somewhere else. We don't know. We don't know. Some of them seem to have similarities with the Egyptians. Some of them seem to have similarities with other things. But we're coming to Plato, we're having a look at it, we're having a look at what he's teaching. And then in the end, you can take or leave it. Does that make sense, Nick?
It does. I guess because we've got this the Christian, we've got this Christian tradition, which is fundamentally that the Christian God is the true sort of belief. And so I guess there's a prejudice that we have to overcome, and that it is okay to be curious and fascinated by all of these different traditions, and I guess sort of pick the better aspects of them, and I guess find what works best for you as an individual.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay. So, anyone else got any reflections on the reading?
I do. I don't know whether this is appropriate at this time, but it just seems to me it's a very masculine perception that there's been, and I did try to see, female philosophers and look them up, but was there anyone else at this time when all this was written and discussed that had another perspective, more of a feminine aspect?
Maria, do you want to comment on that, or do you want to have a go at that one?
I can talk a little bit about the Republic, where Plato says that women and men have equal rights, and women should be educated in exactly the same way as men do, and they could also run for office. They can become rulers, which was the highest status of his republic, and definitely philosophers and rulers.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So basically, in Greek public life, it was male, and women generally didn't learn how to read and write. So they were excluded from this whole discourse which we're engaging with. So it's very hard to know what was going on in the feminine world. So generally speaking, there are some female philosophers, especially later on, but they are certainly the exception. And so it is very much male world, but also a male homoerotic world. And Maria and I are reading the Symposium, which is basically about love, but it's all about, it starts with the ideal love as being the love of an older, a man for a boy, post-pubescent boy, and that was considered to be the highest, at least, form of love at that level. Before you got to, with Plato, you get to a higher level of love. So it is actually quite problematic, I think, for us. You know, it's one of the things, especially, of course, if you're a woman, but it's also the slavery that's there, the treatment of women. What else? You know, there's other difficulties in engaging with this because of you know, the culture at the time. So yeah, it's tricky. And the view is male. Yeah, you do see the view as being male. Like in the lover and the love stuff, the view is from the male point of view.
There have been exceptions, and there were very famous women that took part in symposia and things like that, like Aspasia, and but they were the exceptions. And having said that, you have the highest priestess of the highest oracle, actually being a female, and the god would only speak through this female, Pythia.
Yeah, so is that the oracle at Delphi?
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, which we've already mentioned, haven't we? So we know what we're talking about there. That was female, and it was common for to have priestesses and to have female prophets in general. So, but you know, yeah, they're kind of on the periphery in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what I thought I might also. We've discussed the mystery cults, have we, before? Not sure, nodding heads. So I don't know whether I just threw that in there. So you know, prior to Plato, quite a long time before Plato's time, and during his time and a long time after, there were these mystery cults. The most famous are the Eleusinian and the Orphic mysteries. And the way they operated was kind of like you would go away for, you know, a few days, and you would go through this process of perhaps chanting, music. It involved, you know, being in a cave, hearing, you know, seeing sudden bright lights and all sorts of things going on, which we don't really know that much about. But the point is that you went through this passage of experiences and came out, got to the end, and then you became aware of the mysteries. So the mysteries were like the hidden truths. And so so when you went and did that process and then came out, you were kind of part of a cult, if you like. All the people who had done that mystery, like doing the Hajj or something like that, were kind of members of that cult. And so there was this kind of bond between them all. And some people, there's some ways of interpreting Plato that he was saying that, okay, I'm going to give you the same insights, the same mysteries, but I'm going to give you them in a different way, which is by my method of dialectic, my method of logos, and also using a bit of myth as well. So, so I think there's a strong relationship with them here, but we don't really know we don't know so much about what they taught.
But why mention them, Bernie? I mean, I have sort of seen some reference to them in, you know, just in various kind of internet sites out there, but why are they relevant here?
Well, they seem to have influenced Plato and our tradition, either through Plato or directly, our tradition generally in what we know about them. I use the term, and in the West we use the term mysticism, and Christianity uses the term, you know, it has its mysteries, like its unexplainable truths. And you know, in the words and in the practices, there seems to be some connection with these mystery cults. It's kind of just giving the context, I suppose, in which Plato is engaging, and some of these stories, like our life is a prison, that, you know, and then death is an escape from that prison. You know, some of these statements that he mentions seem to have come from that origin, from the cults. Can anyone see any other affinities? It's interesting with Christianity in this story that we're going into here.
Well, certainly in the Greek Orthodox tradition, there are statements around the mysteries of life, the mysteria, and I don't know whether that might have its origins in the mystery cults.
Well, they certainly
as well,
yeah,
in the mysticism.
Yeah, they certainly use the word. Yeah, and borrowing that word and the power of that word, the extent to which they're borrowing the same rights and practices is a controversial question. Yeah. Can you think of
and sorry, there's also like there's the incense and there's the chanting and candles, you know, all the rituals and things.
Yeah,
that connotation of
the very mass, very process.
It's a process, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's also the belief that the soul leaves the body, and you've got the 40 days in the religion that the soul is moving around to find its place. And as Anastasia said, the incense, and it's for the soul, and all the little rituals that are done for the soul, and that the soul keeps living on.
Yes.
And the words eonia mnimi, so that's about the soul.
Yes, and if you go and look in the Bible for teachings around this, it's very hard to find. Another way that's kind of interesting, I suppose, in the dynamic of the cult of Plato, or if you could call it a religion or tradition of Platonism, and the tradition of Christianity, is that Plato sets up Socrates here in these earlier dialogues as the ideal man, as in a way the leader of the the ideal man, leader of the tradition, the teacher of the tradition. And Socrates is killed by the state. And if you think of other traditions, like where there's an early leader or a prophet, you know, it's hard to find one where the leader is killed by the state. And also at the...
Well, what about Jesus?
Exactly, yeah, that's right. It's quite a thing about Christianity, this thing about Jesus. And so Socrates does kind of fit into this form of religion, where you've got the leader, or the prophet, if you like, being killed by the state at the behest of his fellow people, you know, also. that, because in the trial there was a jury, and the jury found against Socrates.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's powerful. That's a really powerful parallel.
Mm. Good.
So that's almost the Jesus story in a way. But
Yeah, well, this connection has been made through the tradition, you know, but sometimes it's a bit embarrassing to have it, to have that connection. Oh my God! Was
it St. Paul who put the two together?
Yes.
No.
St. Paul who put the two together. Paul the evangelist, the apostle.
Yeah. So like drawing on Plato's work, and kind of when he was kind of creating what Christianity became, he's put this in there because it sounded good.
To some extent, he does.
Yeah.
It also comes actually in the Gospel of John very strongly, in the theology in the Gospel of John, and then really importantly, it then comes in the Church Fathers, who bring in all this stuff that is not in the Jewish tradition and the Gospels.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, there's a whole story around that. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that, Jim. Yeah. So people can hang on there if they want to. I just noticed the time, so I probably should wind up and just say that next week we're going to go. So what has been proposed here is now going to be debated, and it's going to be brought into doubt in many ways. And so in these discussions and these doubts, lots of different philosophically interesting things come up. So you can pay attention at different levels to the debate whether the soul is immortal or not, or you can even just focus your attention on the philosophical issues. So we'll get back to this form of opposites, you know, how opposites are so important to Platonic formalism. And he brings up this notion that generation is by alternation of opposites, whatever that means. And then Achilles was mentioning that learning is remembering what we already knew from when we were born, from our previous lives. So learning is remembering, we'll also get into and see how we can understand that and make sense of that. And take a close look when you're doing this reading, where there's this discussion of like and unlike, a particular opposite, the way things are like and unlike. And then it shifts towards equality in inequality, which I've already mentioned earlier. Like the form of equality, what does that mean? What is the form of equality and how can we define it? It seems to be very elementary. So that stuff is all in the reading next week, and we'll go through it and pick it to pieces a little bit, and yeah, see how you go. If you don't get all the way through it, don't worry, put it down, maybe come back to it, or maybe just wait until the class and then we'll go through it. And it might be a good idea then to try and read it afterwards. I guarantee it'll make a little bit more sense. So thanks for coming tonight. We'll see you next Wednesday at 6:30. And yeah, have a good week. And anyone who wants to stick around and ask any further questions, just hang on there. I'll keep the thing open.
Thanks, Bernie. Thanks.
Bernie.
Good night.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, everybody. Stay
Bye.
safe. Keep well.
Bye.
Bye.
Keep safe.
Yeah, same to you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Kalinista.
Kalinista.
Kalinista ke oniraglika.
Yes, yeah.
I just want to ask you something, Bernie, so I'll hang on.
Go for it, yeah. Yeah.
Could you suggest what female philosophers I could read or suggest?
Oh, okay. So in this tradition, in the Platonic...
I don't, this is all so new to me. So I'm finding, I've been, because I've had lots of time,
Yeah.
I've been lots of reading, and I'm finding this very dense and heavy, and I just would like to see a bit of another perspective
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just thinking female philosophers are not so dense, because I was going to recommend one of my favorite philosophers of all time, a French woman who really got me into this, by the way. Reading her work got me into Plato for the first time. Simone Weil, I think you pronounce her name, Simone Weil. And she's a brilliant, she was a Jew who was absolutely brilliant mathematician. Her brother was also a brilliant mathematician, and I think, you know, topped maths at the Sorbonne and things like that. But she converted to Christianity and kind of sees in Plato and the Pythagoreans in this sort of stuff. She sees the intimations, she calls it, the kind of like the suggestions of Christianity before there was Christianity. She has an interesting relationship with that. So she writes about this stuff, but she also writes just more reflective pieces as well. So there's a few books collecting her essays.
All right.
A good place to start if you particularly want to start with a woman.
Sure, I do. And I like the idea of the maths in there. So that's...
You like the maths?
Yeah, I do.
Ah, you like a woman philosopher and the maths. Great.
Yeah.
Well, then you're going to love
Hypatia?
Hypatia is another one.
Hypatia.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I did see
Can't
that.
read anything of hers, can we?
Yeah, okay. And what the
Have you heard of
circle
Hypatia,
is...
Kathy, by the way? Have you heard of Hypatia?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay. And what Simone Weil? What is she?
Yeah, Weil, I think it is.
And where is she, around what era? Is she recent or is she?
Yeah, so she is recent. She died of anorexia, I think, in the Second World War. So yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, she's had a very interesting life and short life. Yeah, you might find, if you look for her, you'll find collections of essays. I don't know how much she published herself, but since she died, there's been a lot of collections of her. I'm just looking it up now. Yeah, Weil, French philosopher. Yeah, there we go. So you can look her up on Wikipedia or...
Sure, I'll do that.
And find a book. I know it's hard to go, you know, if you went to a good secondhand bookshop, they'd probably have one of her books on the shelf, or I could give you one of mine, but...
It's okay. I can just, Google's amazing. I can just sit there and find things. And the other thing I wanted to say was just of an anecdote was the swan song and the connection with when Socrates, they asked him, aren't you worried about dying? And he said, well, I don't worry about it because the swan song. And so I made that connection with the swan song. Is that right? Is that correct? As the dying last thing that someone does, the final thing is their swan song. And it's been used now in a contemporary...
Oh, that's fantastic. I never made that connection before.
Oh, there you go.
I think it was a general thing, maybe not just from Plato, that swans, it looked like swans were singing when they were dying. Yeah, drawing on a general belief. Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. I got to look that one up as well when I get off. That's the swan song.
Okay, a lot of the footballers in my football team had their swan song, so I've been following that.
Right, that's what comes.
Okay, thank you very much, Bernie.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Well done.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Kelly's heading off?
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay.
Okay.
See you
See
later.
you next week.
Okay.
See you next week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bernie, for giving me this opportunity. I'm really enjoying this thoroughly, and I can't wait for Plato and Christianity. I've actually spoke to my brother, and he's keen too. So
Oh, well, now I've got to do all this work, Maria.
sorry.
Now I've got to do all this work. Yeah, no, it'll be fun. It'll be fun to do.
It's great. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Have a good evening.
Okay.
See you next week. Bye.
Yeah.